Hello everyone, I am Dr. Susengfa Gogoi. Welcome you all to your favorite channel, e-Politica. Everything that you wanted to know on political science. I'm here today again with another module, that is module number 18, to talk about one very important concept associated with political theory. Today, I'm going to talk about positive and negative freedom. So this is the first part of this lecture, that is the module number 18. The next part would be followed after this module. So in this first module, we would be mainly discussing about negative freedom. In the next module, we would be talking about the positive freedom in details. So those who have not gone through the module number 17, I suggest them to kindly go through the module number 17, because that will give you a background understanding of the concept of freedom, how the idea of freedom is important, how it is relevant, what is the degree of difference between freedom and liberty, what are the basic characteristics of freedom, and what are the different types of freedom that has been discussed at length. So those who are new to the channel, I request them to kindly go through the module number 17 before you listen to this module number 18. So by and large, the objective of today's module is to learn the meaning of the positive and negative freedom or liberty, to understand the major ideas of negative freedom of liberty, and we would be limit ourselves in understanding the major characteristics of negative freedom. Regarding the positive freedom, we would be again coming up with the second module. Let us begin. So before we talk about what do you mean by negative freedom or what do you mean by positive freedom, it is very important for us to understand why this classification of freedom as positive and negative is important, or why it is made. Now for that, we need to understand that the concept of freedom has been a very contested concept. If you can see in the module number 17, we already discussed what are the different perspectives of different school of thoughts talked about the concept of freedom. For example, what is the opinion of liberals? What is the opinions of feminists? What is the opinion of the Marxists? What is the opinions of the anarchists regarding the concept of freedom? That was discussed at length. So therefore, it is very important to understand that the idea of freedom always comes up as a contested concept. So these contestations on freedom could be understood or is realized because of three questions, as you can see in the screen. Of whose freedom we are talking about, by whom this freedom need to be guaranteed, and how this freedom need to be protected. These three questions led to create a new sense of debate between two broad categories of subject. One is individual versus community. The second one is individual versus the state. So there are some political philosophers who believe that the concept of freedom is individual centric, and they thought that it is the individual freedom which need to be provided more priority. And but for some, there are some philosophers who believe that the concept of freedom cannot be labeled only as associated with with individuals. Rather, many a time, the concept of freedom has a collective perspective. So therefore, for them, community is more important rather than the individuals. When it comes to the question of how the freedom need to be protected, or who played a role in protecting or reserving the freedom of an individual, there rise again two sets of debates. Some philosophers believe that it is a responsibility of the individual to protect his or her freedom by himself or herself. But there are some people who believe that no, it is a role played by the state in order to protect the freedom of individuals. So therefore, it has been understood that based on these questions about individuals versus the community, individual versus the state, the concept of freedom has been classified broadly into two categories, that is positive freedom and negative freedom. Now as you can see in this diagram, it can be seen that the idea of freedom is categorically divided as positive and negative freedom. When we are talking about a positive freedom, we are talking about the freedom that is regulated by the state. And when we are talking about negative freedom, we are talking about a freedom enjoyed by an individual without having any kind of restraint, any kind of control. So state-oriented or state-controlled freedom is called as positive freedom. And unrestrained freedom, that is without having any kind of restraint or control, has been considered to be the negative freedom. So in this perspective, when we are talking about positive freedom, we are trying to understand freedom as internal concept. So when we are saying that freedom is internal, what does it mean? It means that it is the sole responsibility of the individual to estimate or understand or use his rational being or his rational capacity, that what are the freedom or liberty an individual deserve. So based on his individual choices, a person must learn to enjoy those freedoms which actually can be permitted within the limits of the state. So that internal sense is very important when it comes to the question of positive freedom. When we are talking about a negative freedom, we are talking about something called external freedom. Now, negative freedom, or the proprietors of negative freedom, they believe that the freedom of one individual is not solely related to his or her own choices. Many a time, his or her individual choices or preferences regarding the freedom is not the only thing that can assure freedom to an individual. What does it mean? It means that a person's or individual's freedom is largely dependent on external sources. So it means that if a person's freedom or liberty is not being interfered or not being restrained by any other external individual or external agency, that situation can be considered to be freedom. So therefore, freedom is considered to be external for negative freedom perspective. Now, with this brief introduction in mind, we would be dealing about the concept of positive and negative freedom in details. For this purpose, I would like to quote one important definition that has been made by the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy. It says that negative liberty is the absence of obstacles, barriers, or constraints. So one has negative liberty to the extent that actions are available to one in this negative sense. Positive liberty is the possibility of acting or the fact of acting in such a way as to take control of one's life and realize one's fundamental purposes. While negative liberty is usually attributed to individual agents, positive liberty is sometimes attributed to collectivities, or the individuals considered primarily as members of given collectivities. I am quote. Now, if you look at into this definition that has been given by Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy regarding the classification on positive and negative freedom, one thing is very clear, that the concept of positive freedom is something which is not talking about a restraintless, controlless environment of freedom. Whereas when it comes to negative freedom, it talks about completely controlless, restraintless kind of a freedom, when an individual can enjoy his or her freedom without having any kind of dominance, any kind of control, any kind of restraints, or checks and balances created by the state environment. So therefore, this is a basic argument regarding the positive and negative freedom. Now let us talk more about the concept of negative freedom. As you can see in the screen, the concept of negative freedom, it basically means, when you talk about the concept of negative freedom, it means about absence of constraints. What does it mean? It means that there shall not be any kind of interference by the state in certain activities of the individual, or to enable him to pursue his or her own goals until he or she obstruct others in similar freedom. So therefore, if you are looking at the basic crux of the concept of negative freedom, it also does not talk about complete restlessness or complete restraintless kind of a freedom. So it does not talk about a complete restraintless freedom. What does it talk about then? It talks about having an environment of non-interference by state or state-like agencies until his or her freedom is creating a problem or is not creating a problem or challenge to the freedom of others. So this is what negative freedom basically means. Now, in that sense, there are two questions that should come in our mind. As you can see in the screen, the first one is, does negative freedom mean complete autonomy of doing something which is not worth doing by an individual, or does it also mean freedom of exercise by violating the freedom of others? The answer would be definitely no, because negative freedom does not permit an individual to have excessive freedom by violating or by interfering the freedom of others. So it basically means that within the limits of individual choices, a person should have a restraintless freedom, a controlless freedom, provided it should not interfere or harm the freedom of others. So this is the concept of negative freedom by and large. Now, when you are talking about negative freedom, largely it depended on three conditions. Now, what are these three conditions? As you can see in the screen, the first one is, man is considered to be a rational being. So the propagators of negative freedom, they believe that the concept of negative freedom is depending on the rational capacity of man. It means that they consider human being or individual as a rational being. They believe that man always runs by his own conscience. Man does not run his thoughts or his activities only by his emotions. So the philosophers who believe on negative freedom, they have a deep understanding of the rational capacity of man. So they thought that it is a rational capacity of individual which make an individual to make best choices or best utilization of freedom without having any kind of restraint or without differentiating others for enjoying their own freedoms. So this is about the rational being questions. The second principle that also depend on the concept of negative freedom is the conditions of non-interference. Now what does it mean? It means that the philosophers of negative freedom, they are of the opinion that those people who advocated negative freedom or who talks about a control-less or restraint-less freedom, they should also value the concept of non-interference. So an individual is not supposed to interfere into the freedom of others. So if you have certain freedom to based on your own qualities, you also should give respect to the fact that others could also have similar amount of freedom that is available. So by lieu of this principle, the philosophers of negative freedom, they advocated the idea of control-less or restraint-less freedom by saying that an individual must enjoy his or her freedom without interfering into the freedom of others. So this constitutes the second principle of the concept of negative freedom. The third principle is limited role of the state. Now all the propagators or advocates of negative freedom, they always advocated a minimal kind of a state. Now for them, they do not understand state as important or relevant as an organization in order to provide or creating an environment of freedom. They thought that the idea of freedom is something which is very much natural to individual. So it must not be controlled, it must not be restrained, or it must not be summarized within the limits of some conditions. So an individual must enjoy his or her freedom without having any kind of interference, whether it has to be by an institution called the state. So therefore they always advocated a very minimal role or limited role to the state. So these are the three principles based on which the idea of negative freedom is developed or is being created. Now let us talk about some of the major contributors of the concept of negative freedom. As you can see, some of the major contributors are, for example, Hobbes, Locke, Herbert Spencer, Immanuel Kant, Adam Smith, Hegel, Jeremy Bentham, James Mill, Henry C. Swick, Jefferson, Isaiah Berlin, etc. So these were some of the popular, or you can call them as the major proponents of the ideas of negative freedom. Now let us talk about some of the important contributions of these philosophers in the school of understanding the concept of negative freedom. Here in this context, I would like to talk about the first batch of philosophers who can be together called as the social contextualists. Now, who are the social contextualists I'm talking about in this context? I'm talking about two philosophers, Hobbes and Locke. Now, Hobbes and Locke are the two social contextualists who gave much importance to the concept of individual or individual's freedom. For them, it is the individual freedom which is more important than the collective idea of freedom. So they thought that within the state of nature, individual has certain natural freedoms, and these natural freedoms must not be interfered or must not be controlled by any organization. So they thought that, like Hobbes, for example, Hobbes said that the men, before they came into a political society or before they came into a social life, they live in a state of nature. And in that state of nature, according to Hobbes, man enjoys certain natural rights. These natural rights comes to man as by virtue of his birth. So therefore, social contextualists, they have an utmost advocacy for individual's freedom. Secondly, we can talk about a person called Herbert Spencer. So Herbert Spencer, he has wrote a book, as you can see, called Man versus the State. So he wrote a book called Man versus the State. Now in this book, he advocated state as an opponent to the concept of human liberty. So Herbert Spencer said that within a social life, man follows a philosophy called survival of the fittest. So he believes that only the fit person or the fit individual survives in the competition of the society. So therefore he do not think state is important or relevant in this context, because he thinks that only the best capable men should survive in the society. So therefore he was actually advocating an extreme form of individual freedom. Then come another person called J.S. Mill. So John Stuart Mill, he had wrote a book called On Liberty. In that book, he had demarcated, or rather we could say that he tried to classify freedom into two types, based on two types of actions. self-regarding and others regarding actions. Now, while talking about a negative freedom, although Mill did not talk about directly about the classifying freedom as negative and positive freedom, but he was talking about the concept of self-regarding freedom, which could be understood as individual freedom or can be understood as a negative freedom. Now, he said that many a time, every individual should have certain amount of or certain degree of freedom without having any kind of interference or any kind of dominance. So that individual freedom must not be interfered by any elements of society. What does it mean? It means that a man must left free in order to enjoy his or her freedom. So while talking about that, he also understands that there is a principle called harm principle. He said that while enjoying the freedom, the individual must also realize that the others who are also living in the society, they also have a similar degree of freedom to be enjoyed. So therefore he said that within the limits of negative freedom, he said that an individual must enjoy his freedom but without interfering or harming the freedom of others. So therefore he said that the freedom to be equalized in the society. Every individual should have equal amount of freedom. And while enjoying the equal amount of freedom, an individual is not supposed to interfere into the freedom of others. So this is about the John Stuart Mill's concept of freedom. Then come two important persons. They are Adam Smith and David Ricardo. They were the two famous economists as we know. Now both this Adam Smith and David Ricardo, they are of the opinion that freedom can best be utilized or can best be realized in an environment of laissez-faire economy. Now what is this laissez-faire economy? Now if you look at what Adam Smith and David Ricardo has to offer regarding the laissez-faire economy, he said that the realm of economy must be left free from any kind of control or dominance of the state. Now within this economic environment, Adam Smith and David Ricardo believe that the individual must enjoy his or her freedom without being pressurized or being controlled by the state. So therefore they have advocated something like a minimal state in the realms of economy, but that can also be understood in the realms of freedom also. So therefore a person's liberty or individual's liberty or freedom is largely connected with the concept of state, and they have advocated of a minimal kind of a state while providing maximum freedom to the individual. So therefore they advocated a state called state which can be considered to be a minimal state within a laissez-faire economy. The next person who has also contributed his ideas regarding the development of the concept of negative freedom was Jefferson. Now Jefferson has said that he has advocated a concept called limited government. Now he said that only within a limited government an individual's freedom can be best utilized or can be best realized by an individual. So he said that that government is considered to be the best government which govern the less. So this very important definition from Jefferson made it clear that only within a limited state kind of an environment, only within a minimal kind of a state environment, the individual can have access to maximum amount of freedom. Then come the another person called Isaiah Berlin. Now Isaiah Berlin had also contributed or discussed about at length regarding the concept of negative freedom. Isaiah Berlin had talked about the concept of negative freedom mostly from the angles of non-interference. He feels that every individual has got some innate qualities. Every individual has got some innate or natural rights or natural freedom or natural liberty. This natural liberty and freedom, according to Isaiah Berlin, must not be interfered by any other fellow individual or by any organization or agencies. So therefore he feels that within a environment of non-interference, within an environment of non-controlled or non-regulated environment, an individual's freedom can be best utilized. So therefore these are the major contributors who had talked about the concept of negative freedom. So based on the discussion that we have made so far, now we could try to understand the major characteristics of the concept of negative freedom. The first characteristics, as you can see in the screen, is that negative freedom is considered to be an individualistic concept. As you can see that the concept of negative freedom can be considered to be as individual centric. So idea of negative freedom is individual centric. Now, when I say that the idea of negative freedom is individual centric, what does it mean? It means that the advocates of negative freedom, they believe that it is more important to provide reservations or to provide safety or to protect the freedom of individuals rather than the community freedoms or the collective freedom. So for them, individuals' freedom is more important. So therefore, it is the first characteristics of negative freedom. Number two, negative freedom also advocates the freedom of choice. Negative freedom also advocates the freedom of choice. Here, I would like to quote what Berlin has once asked. He asked that over what area am I master? So what does it mean? That when Berlin asked over what area am I master, it simply means that every individual, according to Isaiah Berlin, had certain choices, that he or she must also know what are the freedom that a person deserves. So by negative freedom, actually the advocates do not talk about complete restless or restraintless kind of a freedom. They do not advocate a complete restraintless kind of a freedom. They do not advocate a complete controlless kind of a freedom. What they have advocated is that an individual must rationally think that what are the best freedom that can develop one's personality. So a person cannot demand something which is unjustifiable. So within the negative freedom, a person must also know what are his or her choices of freedom. So he must not ask for any kind of freedom that does not be deserved by an individual. The third characteristics of negative freedom is it believes on the rational capacity of individual. Now when I say that negative freedom believes on rational capacities of individual, what does it mean? By rational capacity of individual, it simply means that the propagators of negative freedom, they have a deep faith on the rational capacity of men. They believe that men do not make some unreasonable choices. They think that individual cannot make some unreasonable, undeserved choices of freedom. So because man is rational, man is always guided by his capacity of reason. So therefore, they believe that an individual, even within limits of restraintless freedom, make good choices without disturbing or interfering the freedom of others. So therefore, they have a deep faith on the rational capacity of individual. The next one is the advocates of negative freedoms, they give more importance to the idea of minimal state. So this is something, as we have discussed in the previously, we gave reference to Jefferson, we gave reference to Adam Smith, and we said that within a limited kind of a government system or within a limited kind of a state, in a minimal kind of a state only, the idea of freedom can be exercised at its best. Why? Because if the state is minimal, it creates less interference in the lives of individual. So therefore, the freedom of the individual can be entertained at its fullest length. So only within a minimal state that the advocates of negative freedom said that an individual can best utilize his or her own freedom. The next one is the negative freedom also slightly inclined towards capitalism. So this is something very much tricky. Now, how the idea of negative freedom can be related with the idea of capitalism, as you can see, that here I would like to quote one important person called Friedman. Now, Friedman, in his book called Liberty and Capitalism, he tried to draw a connection between freedom with capitalism. He said that in a capitalist kind of environment or in capitalism, it always advocated a free competition of individuals. It advocated free choices for individual to compete. So he said that only within a capitalist kind of a regime or only within a capitalist kind of a system, a person can have negative freedom or can have freedom. So the advocates of negative freedom, therefore, they are slightly inclined towards the concept of capitalism because they feel that because capitalism advocated minimal state, capitalism advocated free competition, so therefore the freedom can be achieved only within this environment of capitalism. So therefore, there is a connection between negative freedom with capitalism. Here we can give reference to what Friedman has said regarding the connection between liberty and capitalism. The next characteristics is the idea of negative freedom also largely dependent on the natural liberty of man. Now this is considered to be another very, very important characteristics of negative freedom. Now when I say that the idea of negative freedom it is largely dependent on the natural liberty of man. What does it mean? Here we can again go back to the social contextualists like Hobbes and Locke, who are of the opinion that the idea of freedom or liberty of an individual is a natural possession of individual. It is not guaranteed or it is not given by any state or state-like organizations or by any kind of a political society. They feel that the freedom that comes naturally to individual, so therefore it need not have any kind of recognition, any kind of interference by any other organizations called the state. So because the freedom is a natural possession of men, it should be left free for enjoyment to the individual. So it has to be given to the individual to decide what degree of freedom to be enjoyed by them and how they are going to use it for the betterment of their own life without disturbing the liberty of others. So therefore, the idea of negative freedom is also largely dependent on the natural liberty question of individuals. And the last one, regarding the characteristics of negative freedom, is that negative freedom advocates the constraints or restrains less freedom. Negative freedom advocates constrain or restrain less freedom. What does it mean? It is very simple that the advocates of negative freedom do not want freedom to be imposed, do not want freedom to be created within a limits of a controlled environment. They feel that an individual must enjoy his or her freedom without having any kind of regulations, without having any kind of restraint or constraint created by fellow individuals or by organization called state. So these are some of the basic characteristics of negative freedom. So this is the first part of the concept of negative and positive freedom. So in the next part of this module number 18, we will be dealing about the positive freedom. Till then, keep watching your favorite channel, e-Politica. Thank you.